There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table in the half-second after something irreversible happens. Not the silence of people choosing not to speak. The silence of an entire room recalibrating, all at once, around something nobody can take back. I felt that silence on a Sunday evening in November, sitting at my mother-in-law's dining table, with a kettle of water that had just been carried, hot and steaming from her kitchen, tipping toward me in her hand. I want to tell you exactly what happened because the exact sequence matters. Diane Ashworth had been cutting at me all evening. Small things. The kind of things she had been doing for 6 years, since the day my husband Theo brought me home and introduced me as the woman he was going to marry. Comments about my family. Comments about where I grew up. A particular way of saying your background, that always landed with the precision of someone who had practiced the phrase in private before deploying it in public. That evening she had gone further than usual. She had said in front of Theo's entire extended family, gathered for what was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday dinner before the holidays, that some people simply did not understand what it meant to build something real. That some people married into things they could never have earned themselves. She was looking directly at me when she said it. I did not respond. I have spent 6 years learning not to respond because responding gave her exactly what she wanted, which was a reason to escalate, a justification she could carry to Theo afterward about how difficult I was, how ungrateful, how unworthy of the family she had built. So I sat there, calm, quiet, the way I have trained myself to be quiet for 6 years. And something about that calm, that specific refusal to give her anything to work with, made something in Diane snap in a way I had never seen before. She stood up from her chair at the head of the table, picked up the kettle she had just brought in to refill the teapot, and as she moved past my chair, the kettle tipped. Boiling water hit my wrist and the side of my hand. I gasped and pulled back instinctively, my chair scraping against the floor, my hand flying up reflexively in front of me, fingers spread, the burn already blooming red and furious across my skin. And in that exact moment, with my hand raised in front of the entire table, the dining room chandelier caught something on my finger and threw a small specific flash of light across the room. My ring. Not the ring Theo had given me when he proposed, which sat on a different finger entirely. The other ring. The one I wore on my right hand. The one Diane had mocked more than once over 6 years as something plain, something inexpensive, something that told her everything she needed to know about where I came from. I watched her eyes follow that flash of light. I watched her face change. Not from anger to apology. Something else entirely. Something I had never once seen on Diane Ashworth's face in 6 years of careful, controlled cruelty. I watched her recognize the ring. And I watched her, for the first time since I had known her, go completely, utterly pale. My name is Maya Ashworth. This is the story of a ring my mother-in-law had looked at dozens of times over 6 years and never once actually seen. And what happened when, finally scalded and shaking at her own dinner table, she finally did. Subscribe right now because this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. New story every single day. Hit that button before we keep going. I need to tell you about my grandmother before I tell you anything else, because nothing in this story makes sense without her. My grandmother's name was Vivian Castellano. She was born in 1938, the daughter of Italian immigrants who ran a small machine shop in an industrial neighborhood that no longer exists in the form it existed then. She grew up understanding metal and mechanics the way some children grow up understanding music, an intuitive fluency that her father recognized early, and, unusually for the era, actively cultivated rather than dismissed because she was a girl. She married my grandfather, Frank Castellano, a distant cousin on her father's side, in 1958. Together they took the small machine shop her father had built and, over the following 2 decades, transformed it into something considerably larger. By 1975, Castellano Precision Manufacturing was supplying specialized components to 3 major industries across the eastern seaboard. I tell you this not as background color but because it is the actual foundation of everything that happened at that dinner table. Vivian Castellano was not a footnote in a family story. She was the architect of a company that, by the time she retired in 1991, employed over 400 people and generated revenue that, adjusted for inflation, would startle most people who heard the number today. In 1991, facing health concerns that would eventually claim her life 11 years later, Vivian made a decision that would ripple forward in ways she could not have fully anticipated. She sold a controlling interest in the company to a younger executive who had worked under her for nearly a decade. A man she trusted, a man she believed would honor what she and Frank had built. She retained a minority stake. Not a controlling interest, not enough to run the company day to day, but enough that her family would always have a connection to what she had spent her life building. She retained that stake specifically, deliberately, with legal structures put in place by an attorney she trusted completely, because she wanted something tangible to pass down to her children and grandchildren, something that represented not just money but the specific, hard-won proof of what a woman with almost no formal education, and an immigrant father's machine shop, had managed to build in a world that did not expect her to build anything at all. That minority stake passed, upon her death in 2002, to her only daughter, my mother, Elena. And upon my mother's death, considerably more recently than I want to spend time discussing in detail right now, it passed to me. The company that Vivian Castellano built, and that her younger executive expanded considerably further over the following decades, exists today under a different name. A name you would likely recognize if I said it, though I am not going to say it in this telling, because the specifics of corporate names are not the point of this story. The executive who bought controlling interests from my grandmother in 1991 was a man named Richard Ashworth, Theo's father, Diane's husband. I want to be completely honest with you about something, because I think honesty matters more in a story like this than the satisfaction of a clean narrative. I knew when Theo first introduced me to his family 6 years ago that his father's company had originally been built by someone else. Theo himself knew this in the vague way that children know family history that predates them, the way you know your grandparents met at a dance or your parents' first apartment had a leaking roof, factual but not emotionally weighted, not something that comes up in ordinary conversation. What I did not know, what I genuinely did not put together until considerably later, was that the someone else who had originally built Richard Ashworth's company was my own grandmother. This sounds, I am aware, like an enormous coincidence, and I want to address that directly because I think it deserves to be addressed rather than glossed over. Theo and I met at a mutual friend's wedding, 400 miles from where either of our families had any history together. We fell in love the way people fall in love, gradually and then suddenly, over conversations about books and arguments about which way to load a dishwasher and the particular comfort of being known by someone who pays attention. It was not until our engagement, almost a year into dating, when Theo's family began the process of formally welcoming me, the kind of welcoming that involves dinners and questions and the careful excavation of family history that happens when two families are about to become one, that the pieces began to surface. Richard, Theo's father, mentioned once at an early dinner that he had built his company from nothing, starting with a small acquisition of a struggling manufacturer in the early 90s. He told this story the way successful men often tell origin stories, with a particular pride that flattens complexity into a more satisfying narrative. I did not connect this immediately to anything in my own family. Why would I? My mother had mentioned the company her own mother had built only occasionally throughout my childhood, usually with a complicated mixture of pride and sadness, because by the time I was old enough to understand what any of it meant, the company existed only as a minority stake in a folder of legal documents my mother kept in a safe deposit box, a connection to a past that felt, to me as a teenager and young adult, abstract and distant. It was my mother, in fact, who eventually made the connection several months into my engagement to Theo, when I mentioned in passing the name of Richard's company during a phone call. She went quiet on the line for a long moment. Then she said, "Maya, that's Castellano Precision. That's the company your grandmother built." I want to walk you through this conversation carefully, because the decisions my mother and I made in the weeks following this discovery shaped everything that happened years later at that dinner table. My mother, Elena, was a careful woman by nature, the kind of person who thought through implications before reacting to immediate impulses. When she told me about the connection between Richard's company and my grandmother's legacy, she did not immediately suggest that I should do anything dramatic with this information. "This complicates things," she said in the careful, measured way she said most things that mattered to her. "You need to think about what this means before you decide what to do with it." What it meant practically was this. My family, through the legal structures my grandmother had established decades earlier, retained a minority equity stake in the company Richard Ashworth now ran as his own, a company that had grown substantially under his leadership but that still, by the original terms of my grandmother's sale agreement, owed a percentage of profits and certain voting rights to her heirs. I want to be precise about something here, because precision matters enormously to how this story should be understood. This was not a secret Richard Ashworth was actively hiding through any criminal or fraudulent means. The arrangement was entirely legal, properly documented, and had simply become, over 30 years, something that existed quietly in the background of corporate paperwork rather than something Richard discussed at dinner parties or family gatherings. It is entirely possible, and I want to be fair to him in saying this, that Richard himself did not think about my grandmother's family with any regularity. Minority stakeholders in companies that have grown as large as his had grown often become, to the executives running those companies, simply line items in quarterly distributions rather than people with names and faces and family histories. What my mother and I decided in those weeks after the discovery was this. We would not announce this connection to Theo's family. We would not use it as leverage, or as a way of establishing standing within a family that even then 6 years ago, was already showing signs of the particular coldness that Diane would direct at me with increasing precision over the years that followed. Let them love you for who you are, my mother told me. Or let them show you clearly if they cannot do that. Either way, you'll know something true about them before this becomes relevant. I married Theo without ever mentioning the connection to his family. Theo himself did not know, for the first several years of our marriage, that my grandmother's company and his father's company were the same entity under different ownership. I was not hiding this from him out of deception. I was simply waiting the way my mother had taught me to wait, for the right context, for a moment when the information would serve something other than my own defense. That moment, as it turned out, would take 6 years to arrive. I need to describe Diane Ashworth to you carefully, because I think it is important to understand her as a complete person rather than simply as the villain of this particular evening. Diane is 63 years old. She married Richard in 1989, 2 years before he acquired controlling interest in what had been Castellano Precision Manufacturing. She has spent the subsequent decades building a particular kind of life around her husband's success, the kind of life that involves charity boards and country club memberships, and a very specific, carefully maintained understanding of where her family sits within their social world. I do not believe Diane is a fundamentally cruel person in some abstract, essential sense. I believe Diane is a person who built her entire identity around a story, the story of her husband's self-made success, the story of a family that rose through merit and hard work and intelligence, and that any information complicating that story registers, somewhere deep in her psychology, as a genuine threat to who she believes herself to be. When Theo brought me home 6 years ago, Diane's first assessment of me was, I believe, entirely instinctive and entirely about class. I grew up in a comfortable but unremarkable suburban household. My father worked as a high school science teacher for 31 years. My mother worked part-time at a public library for most of my childhood. After her own mother's company had been sold and the family's relationship to wealth had become, by the time I was born, considerably more modest than it had been a generation earlier. I did not arrive in Diane's world with the credentials she had apparently decided were necessary for her son's wife. I had not attended the right schools in her estimation. My family did not belong to the right clubs, did not summer in the right places, did not carry the right names within the social circles Diane had spent decades cultivating. She communicated this assessment to me from our very first meeting 6 years ago, in ways that were almost always indirect, almost always deniable if I had ever tried to name them directly. A particular tone when asking about my father's profession. A slight pause before saying my mother's name, as though confirming she had heard it correctly the first time. Questions about my education that were technically polite but carried an unmistakable undertone of evaluation. Over 6 years these moments accumulated. I am not going to recount every single one of them here, because I think the specific catalog matters less than the overall pattern, which Theo, to his credit, eventually began to notice himself, though it took him longer than I sometimes wished it had, because children, even adult children, often have enormous difficulty seeing their parents clearly, particularly parents who have spent decades perfecting a particular kind of socially acceptable cruelty. The ring became, over those 6 years, one of Diane's favorite targets. I need to tell you about the ring itself because the ring is the actual center of everything that happened at that dinner table. My grandmother Vivian wore a particular ring for most of her adult life, a ring my grandfather Frank had made for her himself, in the early years of their marriage, using skills he had learned working in her father's machine shop. It was not, by conventional jewelry standards, an especially valuable object. The metal was a simple white gold. The stone a modest sapphire that Frank had purchased with money he had saved from several months of overtime work. What made the ring valuable, what made it the single most precious object my mother eventually passed to me, was not its market price but its history. My grandmother wore that ring through every year of building Castellano Precision Manufacturing. She wore it the day she signed the sale agreement with Richard Ashworth in 1991. She wore it, according to my mother's memory, on the day she died in 2002, my mother having specifically requested that the funeral home allow her to keep the ring on her mother's hand for the viewing, removing it only afterward to be passed down through the family. My mother gave me this ring on my 25th birthday, several years before I met Theo, in a quiet ceremony that involved just the two of us at her kitchen table. No audience, no announcement, simply a mother passing something essential to her daughter with the specific, careful weight such moments carry. This was your great-grandmother's metal shop, and your great-grandfather's machine shop, and your grandmother's company and your grandfather's hands, my mother told me, sliding the ring onto my finger herself. It doesn't look like much. It was never supposed to look like much. It was supposed to last. I wore that ring on my right hand every single day from that point forward, including throughout my entire relationship with Theo and our subsequent 6 years of marriage. Diane noticed it within the first few months of meeting me. I remember the specific moment clearly. A holiday gathering at the Ashworth family home. My second time meeting Diane's extended social circle. She took my hand, ostensibly to admire it, and turned it over, examining the ring with an expression that I initially mistook for genuine interest. "That's an interesting little piece," she said, in a tone I would come to recognize as her signature register of condescension disguised as politeness. "Family piece." "Yes," I said. "My grandmother's." "How sweet," she said, releasing my hand. "Sentimental value, I'm sure, even if it's not exactly." And here she paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who has practiced cruelty until it sounds like casual observation. "A significant stone." I said nothing in response. I had already, by that early point in our acquaintance, begun to understand that responding to Diane's comments simply gave her additional material to work with. Over the subsequent 6 years, the ring became a recurring point of reference for Diane's particular brand of cruelty. She would comment on it at family gatherings, always with the same surface politeness, always carrying the same unmistakable undertone. She once suggested, at a dinner celebrating Theo's promotion at his own firm, that I might consider upgrading to something more appropriate, now that I was officially part of the Ashworth family. She once asked, in front of several of her friends, whether I had ever considered having the stone reset into something a bit more substantial. I never explained the ring's actual history to her. I never told her about Vivian Castellano, about the machine shop, about Castellano Precision Manufacturing, about the minority stake my family still held in the company her own husband ran. I simply absorbed her comments year after year the way I absorbed everything else Diane directed at me, because my mother's voice from that kitchen table years earlier stayed with me throughout. Let them show you clearly who they are. The information would matter eventually. I simply did not yet know when. I want to give you a fuller picture of the 6 years between my engagement to Theo and the dinner where everything finally came apart, because the dinner itself does not exist in isolation. It is the culmination of a pattern that built slowly, deliberately, over an extended period. Theo and I married in a small ceremony, against Diane's repeated suggestions that we should have something larger, something more befitting, in her words, the family's standing. We chose intimacy over spectacle, a decision Diane interpreted, I believe genuinely, as evidence that I was either insufficiently ambitious for her son or, in her less generous moments, deliberately depriving her of an opportunity to showcase the family's social position to the appropriate audience. Our first years of marriage involved navigating holidays and family gatherings with a particular kind of careful diplomacy. Theo, to his credit, gradually began noticing the specific pattern of his mother's behavior toward me, though this awareness developed slowly, complicated by the natural difficulty adult children have in seeing their parents as anything other than the people who raised them. I remember a particular conversation perhaps 3 years into our marriage, when Theo finally said, somewhat tentatively, over dinner at our own apartment, "I think my mother is harder on you than she needs to be." It was not, I want to be clear, a dramatic confrontation or a sudden awakening. It was simply an observation, offered carefully, The beginning of a slow process by which Theo began holding space for the reality of his mother's behavior rather than explaining it away or minimizing it for the sake of family harmony. I did not, during these years, ever share with Theo the full history of the ring, or the connection between my grandmother's company and his father's. I want to be honest about my reasoning here because I think it matters to understanding the choices I made. Part of my reasoning was strategic, the patient waiting my mother had counseled. But part of it, I will admit honestly, was a genuine reluctance to introduce something that might complicate Theo's relationship with his own father, a relationship that, whatever its limitations, mattered to Theo in ways I respected and did not want to disrupt unnecessarily. Richard, Theo's father, I should say clearly, was never directly cruel to me in the specific way Diane was. He was distant, occasionally awkward, generally absorbed in the considerable demands of running a company that had grown substantially under his leadership. I do not believe Richard actively participated in Diane's particular campaign of condescension. I believe, more accurately, that Richard simply did not pay close enough attention to notice it, or chose not to involve himself in what he likely perceived as the social dynamics his wife managed within their family circle. My own mother, Elena, passed away during the 4th year of my marriage to Theo, after a relatively brief illness that I will not detail extensively here because some griefs deserve to remain private even within a story being shared publicly. Her passing left me, among many other things, as the sole inheritor of the Castellano family's remaining connection to the company, the legal stake formalized through documents my mother had maintained carefully throughout her own life. I did not, even then, in the immediate aftermath of my mother's death, share this information with Theo's family. Grief, I found, required all of my available emotional resources, and the strategic question of when and how to reveal a complicated corporate history felt, for a long time afterward, entirely beside the point of simply surviving each day. Diane attended my mother's funeral. I want to note this because it complicates any simple narrative of her as purely villainous. She brought flowers. She offered what appeared to be genuine condolences. For a brief period afterward, perhaps 2 or 3 months, her usual pattern of subtle cruelty toward me softened considerably, whether out of genuine sympathy or simply social convention regarding appropriate behavior toward the recently bereaved. The softening did not last. By the following year's holiday gathering, Diane had returned, fully and apparently without any sense of inconsistency, to her familiar pattern of comments about my background, my family, and with particular regularity, the ring on my right hand. I want to spend some time on Theo specifically, because I think the gradual process by which he came to fully see his mother's behavior is its own important thread in this story, separate from the eventual dramatic revelation at the dinner table. In our first year of marriage, Theo genuinely did not see the pattern clearly. I do not say this as criticism exactly, though it took me considerable time to arrive at that more generous framing. Children, even adult children, develop over decades a particular relationship to their parents' behavior that operates partly outside conscious analysis. Theo had grown up inside Diane's particular communication style, had absorbed her comments and corrections and subtle hierarchies of approval as simply the texture of family life, the water he had swum in since birth. Recognizing that water is something specific, something with its own temperature and chemical composition that could be analyzed and named, required a kind of perspective shift that does not happen instantly, even for someone who loves you and wants genuinely to protect you. The first crack in Theo's blindness came, as I mentioned, around our 3rd year of marriage, during that dinner conversation at our own apartment when he observed, somewhat tentatively, that his mother seemed harder on me than necessary. I remember exactly how careful he was in raising it, the way he phrased it as an observation rather than an accusation, testing the water of a conversation he was not yet certain he wanted to have fully. I did not, in that moment, unload 6 years of accumulated grievance onto him. I told him simply that yes, I had noticed it too, and that I appreciated him saying something. I did not catalog every specific instance. I did not demand that he confront his mother immediately. I understood even then that pushing too hard, too fast, risked triggering exactly the kind of defensive loyalty that often makes adult children retreat from clear sight of their parents' flaws rather than move toward it. Over the following 2 years, the awakening continued in small increments. Theo began noticing things himself, without my needing to point them out. He noticed the particular pause before Diane said my mother's name. He noticed how she complimented Caroline's husband's career achievements at length while offering only brief, perfunctory acknowledgement of mine. He noticed, with growing discomfort, how often conversations at family gatherings drifted toward topics that highlighted distinctions between families who had built something and families who had not, distinctions that always seemed to leave my own family on the less favorable side of the comparison. I keep thinking about all the times growing up when she talked about people in similar terms. He told me once, perhaps 4 years into our marriage, after a particularly pointed comment from Diane at a dinner we had attended. I never thought about what that actually meant. I just absorbed it as how my mother talks. I'm starting to understand that the way she talks isn't neutral. It's actually doing something. It's drawing lines all the time between people who deserve respect and people who don't, and the line always seems to favor whoever already has more. I told him that recognizing this, even years into our marriage, mattered considerably more than never recognizing it at all. By the time of the dinner I am about to describe to you, Theo had developed a much clearer, much less forgiving understanding of his mother's patterns than he possessed in our early years together. This matters to understanding his reaction at that dinner table, because the speed and intensity with which he intervened reflected years of gradually accumulated clarity, rather than a sudden, isolated reaction to a single bad moment. The dinner that finally broke this pattern open occurred on a Sunday evening in November, 3 weeks before what would have been the family's larger holiday gathering. A smaller dinner Diane had organized specifically, she said, to discuss plans for the upcoming holidays with the extended family. I want to walk through this dinner carefully, because every detail of how it unfolded matters to understanding what happened. The dinner included Theo and me, Richard and Diane, Theo's older sister Caroline with her husband Marcus, and Richard's brother Walter, Theo's uncle with his wife Joan. 8 people total, seated around Diane's formal dining table, the kind of gathering that Diane managed with considerable attention to presentation, the china carefully selected weeks in advance, the seating arrangement deliberate, place cards written in her precise, looping handwriting even for a gathering of family she saw regularly. I remember the specific tablecloth that evening, ivory linen with a subtle damask pattern, because I had complimented it once years earlier at a different dinner, and Diane had informed me, with the particular precision she reserved for correcting me, that it had been her own mother's, brought from a different country entirely, a detail she shared in a way that managed to communicate both pride in her heritage and a quiet implication about the relative thinness of mine. Conversation through the first portion of the meal remained largely ordinary, the kind of catching up and small talk that fills family gatherings without particular incident. Caroline discussed her children's school activities, a recent parent-teacher conference that had gone better than expected. Walter mentioned a fishing trip he was planning for the spring. Richard talked briefly about a development at the company that had required his attention that week, something about a supplier contract renegotiation that he described with the particular satisfaction of a man discussing problems he enjoys solving. The conversation moved, as it often did at these gatherings, in directions that did not particularly involve me, a pattern I had grown accustomed to over 6 years of family dinners. I had developed over that time a kind of practiced presence at these gatherings, attentive enough to participate when directly addressed, quiet enough not to draw unnecessary attention, the careful balance required of someone who has learned that visibility in certain rooms carries more risk than reward. Theo, beside me, occasionally rested his hand briefly on my knee under the table, a small gesture of solidarity that had become, over the years, a kind of shorthand between us, his way of checking whether I was holding steady through whatever the evening required. The shift began during the second course, when Diane rose to refill wine glasses around the table, the kettle for after-dinner tea already warming on the small burner near the sideboard, a routine I had witnessed at dozens of similar dinners. As she circled the table with the wine, she paused near my chair, and I felt the particular shift in atmosphere that I had learned, over 6 years, to recognize as the prelude to something deliberate. I read an interesting article this week, she said, addressing the table generally, though I could feel, even before she finished the sentence, that the comment was constructed with a specific destination in mind. About social mobility. About the difference between families who understand the importance of legacy, who build something that lasts across generations through careful, deliberate cultivation, and families who simply move from one paycheck to the next without any larger sense of what they're actually contributing to the world. She set down the wine bottle with a small, precise click against the sideboard. I found it fascinating, she continued, how rarely people in the second category seem to recognize the difference. They assume that simply working hard, simply getting by, is the same as actually building something. It isn't, of course, but it takes a certain kind of perspective to understand that distinction. The table had gone quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when everyone present recognizes a comment has crossed from general observation into pointed territory. Caroline's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Joan glanced toward her husband Walter with the specific expression of someone gauging whether to intervene in a family dynamic she had witnessed before but never directly participated in. I felt Theo's hand tighten slightly on my knee. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying a tightness I had heard developing over the past several years, a tightness that had not existed in our early years of marriage but had grown, gradually, alongside his increasing awareness of his mother's patterns. "What exactly are you trying to say?" "I'm not trying to say anything in particular," Diane said, returning to her seat at the head of the table, her tone carrying the practiced innocence she always deployed immediately after delivering something pointed. "I'm simply sharing an interesting article." "You're always so quick to assume I have some hidden agenda, Theo." "You usually do," Caroline said quietly, not quite under her breath, a small act of solidarity from Theo's sister that surprised me slightly, given that Caroline had, over the years, generally remained neutral in the particular dynamic between Diane and me, neither participating in her mother's comments nor directly challenging them. Diane's expression flickered toward her daughter, something sharp and brief crossing her face before she composed herself again. "I simply think it's important," Diane continued, and now she was looking directly at me, the pretense of general observation abandoned entirely, "to understand the difference between people who build things, who create genuine value through generations of effort and sacrifice, and people who marry into things they could never have built themselves. There's no shame in that distinction. It's simply factual. Some people are builders. Some people are, let's say, beneficiaries of other people's building." I sat very still. I had absorbed comments like this for 6 years, and my instinct, trained by long practice, was to remain calm, to give her nothing to work with, to let the comment exist in the room without amplifying it through visible reaction. I looked at my plate, at the careful arrangement of food I had barely touched, and I felt the familiar, practiced discipline of staying quiet settle over me like a coat I had worn so many times it no longer required conscious effort to put on. "Mother," Theo said again, and this time his voice carried less restraint, "that's incredibly unfair to Maya, and I think you know that." "I'm simply making an observation," Diane said, her own voice taking on the particular brittle quality it acquired when she felt challenged, a quality that always seemed to function as both defense and weapon simultaneously. "There's no need to be so sensitive about it. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm discussing an article." "You're discussing Maya," Theo said, "using an article as cover." "Theo," Richard said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had spent decades managing the friction between his wife and the rest of the family, "perhaps we could move to a different topic." "I would love to move to a different topic," Diane said, her tone sharpening further. "If my own son would stop treating every observation I make as some kind of personal attack on his wife." I still said nothing. I looked at my plate. I felt Theo's hand still resting on my knee, his fingers pressed slightly harder now. A silent question I answered with the smallest possible pressure back. A signal we had developed over years that meant, "I'm okay. Let it pass. Don't escalate further." I waited for the moment to pass, the way I had waited through dozens of similar moments across 6 years. It did not pass the way it usually did. Diane stood up from her chair to retrieve the kettle from the sideboard behind her, intending, she would later claim, simply to refill the teapot for the table. I want to be careful here about describing exactly what happened because the question of intention matters enormously to how this moment should be understood, and I do not want to claim certainty I do not actually possess about what was happening inside Diane's mind in that specific second. What I observed from my seat was this. Diane retrieved the kettle, which had been kept warm on a small burner near the sideboard throughout the meal, in preparation for after-dinner tea. She turned, kettle in hand, and began moving back toward the table, her path taking her directly past my chair, positioned at the corner nearest the sideboard. As she passed my chair, her hand tilted, and the kettle's spout released a stream of water directly onto my wrist and the side of my hand, which had been resting on the table near my water glass. The water was, by every account from everyone present including my own immediate physical experience, genuinely boiling. having just come from active heat moments before. I gasped, the sound involuntary and sharp, my chair scraping backward as I pulled my hand up reflexively, the burn already announcing itself in red, blooming patches across my skin. The table erupted into immediate motion. Caroline was on her feet first, moving toward the kitchen for ice. Theo's chair had toppled slightly as he stood too quickly, reaching for my arm. Richard's uncle was saying something about cold water, about the importance of immediate treatment for burns. Diane stood frozen, the now empty kettle still in her hand, her face displaying what I can only describe, in that immediate moment, as genuine shock, the specific shock of someone confronting the physical consequences of an action whose intentionality even she herself may not have fully processed in the moment of its occurrence. "I didn't," she started to say. "It just slipped. I was turning in the kettle." I do not know, even now with complete certainty, whether Diane's action was a genuine accident, the kind of physical mishap that occurs when someone moves through a tense moment while distracted by their own emotional state, or whether some deeper, less conscious impulse guided her hand in that specific direction at that specific moment. What I know with absolute certainty is what happened immediately after. In the chaos of the table erupting into motion, my hand raised reflexively in front of me, fingers spread against the pane, and the dining room chandelier above the table caught the ring on my right hand and threw a small, specific flash of light directly across the room, directly into Diane's line of sight, as she stood frozen with the empty kettle. I watched her eyes track that flash of light. I watched recognition move across her face, slow and then suddenly complete, the specific recognition of someone who has looked at an object dozens of times without truly seeing it, and is now for the first time actually seeing it. I watched her face go from shock at what she had just done, to something else entirely. She went pale. Genuinely, visibly pale, the color draining from her face in a way that had nothing to do with the burn on my wrist, and everything to do with whatever was happening in her own mind as she stared at that ring. "Where?" she said, her voice barely audible over the continued commotion of Caroline returning with ice, Theo still gripping my other arm. "Did you get that ring?" I want to explain what was happening in Diane's mind in that moment because I believe, based on everything that followed, I have a reasonably accurate understanding of it. Diane Ashworth had, over 35 years of marriage to Richard, become intimately familiar with the history of his company, the company he had built, in the version of the story she had constructed and maintained throughout their marriage, almost entirely through his own vision and effort. What I did not know until that evening was that Richard had, in fact, kept a small collection of materials from the original Castellano Precision Manufacturing, materials he had retained out of what I would later learn was a genuine, if rarely expressed, respect for the company's original founder. Among these materials was a photograph, framed and displayed in Richard's home office for decades, a photograph of Vivian Castellano at her retirement celebration in 1991, shaking hands with Richard himself as the sale of controlling interest was finalized. In that photograph, visible if one looked closely enough, which Diane apparently had at some point across 35 years of living in that house, was Vivian Castellano's hand, extended toward Richard's in the handshake, wearing a particular ring. A simple white gold band. A modest sapphire stone. The exact ring that had just thrown light across her dining room. I learned this detail considerably later, in the difficult conversation that followed in the weeks after this dinner. But I want to place it here, in the narrative, because it explains the specific speed and completeness of Diane's recognition in that moment. She was not simply noticing for the first time that my ring looked old or unusual. She was recognizing with the particular horror of sudden complete understanding, an object she had looked at in photograph form in her own husband's office for over 3 decades. "It was my grandmother's," I said, my voice tight with the continued pain in my wrist, Caroline pressing a cloth wrapped around ice against the burn. Vivian Castellano. The name landed in the room like something physical. Richard, who had been standing near the kitchen doorway, processing the chaos of the burn and his wife's frozen posture, went very still at the sound of that name. "Castellano," he repeated, his voice carrying a different quality than Diane's, something more like dawning, careful comprehension rather than pure shock. "Vivian Castellano. From the company." "Yes," I said. "She was your grandmother." "Yes." The room had gone almost entirely silent now, the urgency of the burn treatment continuing in practical terms, Caroline still holding the ice, Theo still gripping my arm, but the emotional center of the room had shifted entirely away from the physical injury and toward something else, something that everyone present, even those who did not yet understand the full context, could sense had become the actual significant event of the evening. "I don't understand," Diane said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it in 6 years. "You're telling me that Maya's grandmother is the same Castellano whose name was on Richard's original company?" "Not just the same name, Mother," Theo said slowly, his own voice working through a realization happening in real time. "She's saying Maya's grandmother founded that company. The company Dad bought. I want to be honest with you about something that I think matters for understanding what kind of story this actually is. I did not, in the immediate aftermath of that dinner, experience the moment as a triumphant reversal, the kind of satisfying narrative beat where the villain finally gets her comeuppance and the wronged party emerges victorious. What I experienced in the days immediately following was considerably more complicated than that. The burn on my wrist required several days of careful treatment, ultimately healing without permanent damage but leaving, for a period of weeks, a visible reminder of that evening that I caught sight of every time I reached for a coffee cup or typed at my keyboard. I want to be clear that the physical injury, regardless of its ultimate severity, was real, and the experience of being burned, regardless of intentionality, by my mother-in-law at her own dinner table was genuinely traumatic in ways that took time to fully process. The conversations that followed, in the weeks after that dinner, were not simple. Theo and I spent considerable time discussing what the revelation meant, both for our immediate family and for the broader Ashworth family dynamics that had shaped 6 years of our marriage. I provided, eventually, when Richard requested it through Theo, the documentation that confirmed the connection. The original sale agreement from 1991, the legal structures my grandmother had established, the minority stake that my family had retained, formalized through decades of careful corporate paperwork that my mother had maintained meticulously throughout her own life. Richard's response to this confirmation was, I want to say clearly, more complicated and more genuinely reflective than I had expected. He requested a meeting with me directly, without Diane present, a conversation that took place at his office several weeks after the dinner. I remember the specific details of his office that day because I had never actually been there before in 6 years of marriage to his son, an absence that itself perhaps says something about the distance that had existed, until then, between Richard and me as individuals rather than simply as family by marriage. The office occupied a corner suite with windows on 2 sides, and on the wall opposite his desk hung exactly the photograph I had heard about through subsequent conversations, though I had not yet seen it myself at the time of our meeting. He noticed me looking at it almost immediately after I sat down. "That's your grandmother," he said, gesturing toward the frame. 1991. The day we finalized the sale. I stood and walked closer to examine it properly. Vivian Castellano stood in a sharp navy suit, her hair styled in the particular way women of her generation favored for important occasions, her hand extended toward a considerably younger Richard Ashworth, both of them smiling for the photographer in the particular formal way people smile when a moment is understood, even as it happens, to be historically significant. And there on her extended hand, exactly as Diane had apparently glimpsed decades later in a single chaotic second at her own dinner table, was the ring. "I've looked at this photograph nearly every day for over 30 years, Richard said, his voice carrying something I had not expected, a kind of weight that suggested he had thought about this moment, this conversation, considerably more than I had assumed before walking into his office. "I want you to know something. I have always respected what your grandmother built. I bought that company because I recognized it was exceptional, because the precision and the culture she had created in that workshop was unlike anything else I had encountered in my career up to that point. I have tried, across 30 years, to honor what she started even as I expanded it considerably beyond its original scope." He paused, and I watched him search for the next part of what he wanted to say, the careful consideration of a man who did not often have to articulate difficult feelings aloud. "I did not know until 3 weeks ago that the woman my son married was her granddaughter," he continued. "I want you to understand that this changes nothing about how I should have treated you from the beginning. You deserved respect as my son's wife regardless of any connection to the company's history. The fact that this connection exists simply makes my failure to provide that respect considerably more difficult to excuse. I was in the room, Maya, at dozens of dinners over 6 years. I heard some of what my wife said to you. I did not intervene the way I should have. I told myself it was simply how Diane processed her own anxieties about family and status, something to be managed rather than confronted directly. I understand now that this was its own kind of failure, separate from anything about your grandmother's company. Thank you for saying that. I told him, and I meant it, though I also felt, sitting in that office, the particular complicated weight of receiving an apology that had taken 6 years and a scalding injury to finally arrive. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer honestly regardless of how it might affect anything going forward. Did you ever consider, at any point over these 6 years, using this information? The stake your family holds. The history with your grandmother. Did you ever think about deploying it as leverage, given how Diane treated you? I thought about this question carefully before answering, because I wanted to give him an honest response rather than simply the answer that might sound most flattering. I thought about it, I admitted. Not often, and never seriously as an actual plan. But there were evenings, after particularly difficult comments from Diane, when I thought about what it would feel like to simply tell her, to watch her face change the way it eventually changed at that dinner. I never did it, partly because my mother had counseled patience, and partly because I genuinely did not want my marriage to Theo, or my relationship with your family, to be built on information used as a weapon rather than relationships built on their own merit. I wanted to be seen as worthy of respect on my own terms, not because of what my grandmother had built decades before I was born. Richard nodded slowly, and I saw something shift slightly in his expression, a kind of respect that had not been fully present when I first sat down. Your grandmother would have understood that instinct, he said. She was a private person, in my experience of working alongside her in those final years before the sale. She did not believe in flaunting accomplishment. She believed in simply doing the work and letting the work speak. That's what my mother always told me, I said. Let them show you who they are. The information would matter eventually. It mattered considerably, Richard said. Though I wish, genuinely, it had not required boiling water to finally surface. This was, I want to note, a more thoughtful response than I had ever received from Diane, even after the full revelation became clear to her. Diane's response unfolded more slowly, and with considerably more difficulty. I want to describe what happened with Diane carefully, because I think the slow, uneven nature of her response matters to understanding this story honestly, rather than offering a falsely clean redemption arc. In the immediate days after the dinner, Diane did not contact me directly. Theo reported that she remained largely silent on the subject, processing, he believed, the magnitude of what had happened in ways that did not yet translate into direct communication with me. When she did finally reach out, approximately 3 weeks after the dinner, it was through a letter rather than a phone call or in-person conversation, a choice that Theo suggested reflected Diane's particular difficulty with direct emotional confrontation, especially regarding her own failures. I am not going to share the entire content of that letter, because some of it remains private between Diane and me. What I will share is this. The letter acknowledged, with more directness than I had expected, the pattern of comments she had directed at me over 6 years regarding the ring specifically and my background generally. It did not, I want to be honest, fully account for the incident with the kettle, which Diane continued to characterize in that letter and in subsequent conversations, as a genuine accident unconnected to any deeper impulse, a characterization I have chosen, for the sake of moving forward within the family, to accept at face value, regardless of my own private uncertainty about its complete accuracy. What the letter did acknowledge, clearly and without the usual deflection I had come to expect from Diane, was this. She had spent 6 years constructing a narrative about my worthiness within the family that was, in her own words, built on assumptions I never bothered to examine, because examining them would have required acknowledging that my own sense of superiority was considerably less stable than I needed it to be. This was for Diane an extraordinary admission, and I want to give her credit for making it, even as I remain honestly uncertain about how completely it represents a genuine internal shift versus a strategic recalibration, in response to information that changed the practical power dynamics of our family relationship. The truth, as I have come to understand it in the months since that dinner, likely contains elements of both. Diane is genuinely capable of reflection, when circumstances force that reflection upon her with sufficient clarity. Diane is also genuinely invested in maintaining a particular social position, And the revelation about my grandmother's company undeniably altered the practical calculations involved in that position. I do not think these two truths are mutually exclusive. I think most people, confronted with information that simultaneously challenges their self-image and their practical interests, respond with some combination of genuine reflection and strategic adjustment, and I have made peace with not being able to fully separate those threads in Diane's case. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Caroline, Theo's older sister, in the weeks following the dinner, because it gave me a perspective on the family dynamics that I had not fully possessed before. Caroline called me directly about 10 days after the dinner, asking if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, away from the rest of the family's processing of what had happened. I agreed, somewhat uncertain about what the conversation would involve, since Caroline and I had maintained a polite but not especially close relationship across 6 years, neither of us actively unkind to the other but also neither of us having developed the kind of genuine closeness that sometimes grows between sisters-in-law. We met at a small cafe near her office, and after the initial pleasantries, Caroline became unusually direct. "I need to apologize to you," she said, "for 6 years of staying quiet." I told her she did not owe me an apology, that the dynamics of the family were not her responsibility to manage. "I think they were partly," she said. "I noticed everything my mother did to you over the years. Every comment about your family, every backhanded remark about the ring, all of it. I noticed, and I never said anything because saying something would have meant confronting my own mother in a way I was never brave enough to do. I told myself it wasn't my fight, that you and Theo would handle it eventually, that getting involved would just create more conflict without actually helping you." "That's understandable," I said, and I meant it, though I also recognize the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the person everyone privately sympathizes with while nobody actually intervenes. "It's not really understandable," Caroline said. "It was cowardice, dressed up as not wanting to interfere. I watched my mother treat you like you needed to prove yourself worthy of this family for 6 years, and I let it happen because confronting her would have been uncomfortable for me. That's not a good enough reason. I'm sorry." I appreciated this honesty more than I had expected to, partly because Caroline's willingness to name her own failure clearly, without the deflection that characterized Diane's eventual acknowledgement, felt like a different category of accountability altogether. "Can I tell you something else?" Caroline asked, and when I nodded she continued. "I think part of why I never said anything is that I grew up watching my mother do this to other people too. Not just you. She did it to my husband's family, early in our marriage, before they eventually proved themselves through certain professional accomplishments that satisfied whatever internal scorecard my mother keeps. She did it to a friend of mine in college that she decided wasn't suitable company for me. I think I absorbed somewhere along the way that this was just how she operated, and that the people on the receiving end eventually either proved themselves or drifted away, and that this was simply an unfortunate but unchangeable feature of how my mother moved through the world." "That's a difficult thing to grow up absorbing," I said. "It is," Caroline agreed. "And I think watching what happened at that dinner, watching her actually injure you physically in our family's dining room, finally made something click that 6 years of comments never quite managed to click into place. There's a difference between unkind words and boiling water. I couldn't keep telling myself it was just how Mom talks after that." We talked for considerably longer that afternoon, and I want to tell you that this conversation marked the beginning of an actual friendship between Caroline and me, something that had not existed in our previous 6 years of polite but distant family relations. We see each other regularly now, independent of larger family gatherings, and I have come to genuinely value her as both a sister-in-law and increasingly, simply as a friend. I share this part of the story because I think it illustrates something important about how harm like Diane's operates within families. It is rarely sustained by one person alone. It is sustained by an entire system of people who notice, who privately disapprove, but who choose silence because confrontation feels costlier than complicity. Caroline's eventual willingness to break that silence, even belatedly, even only after a dramatic injury forced the issue into undeniable visibility, mattered considerably to my own healing process in the months that followed. I want to tell you where things stand now, several months after that dinner, because I think an honest ending matters more than a triumphant one. Diane and I have had several direct conversations since that letter, conversations that remain, I want to be honest, somewhat formal and careful, lacking the warmth that I do not believe will ever fully develop between us, regardless of how thoroughly she processes her own failures. I have made peace with this. Not every relationship within a family resolves into closeness, and I have stopped expecting that particular outcome from my relationship with Diane. What has changed concretely is this. Diane no longer makes comments about my background, my family, or, with particular significance, the ring on my right hand. Whether this change reflects genuine internal transformation or simply careful strategic restraint given the altered power dynamics within the family, I cannot say with complete certainty, and I have decided that the practical outcome, the absence of 6 years of accumulated cruelty, matters more to my daily well-being than achieving certainty about her internal motivations. Richard and I have developed, somewhat unexpectedly, a more genuine relationship than existed before that dinner. He has shared with me, over several subsequent conversations, additional materials and memories related to my grandmother's company, including stories from former employees who worked under her leadership and remember her, by every account, as a demanding but deeply respected leader. He has also, in a gesture I found genuinely moving, formally acknowledged my family's continued minority stake in board communications going forward, a small but meaningful correction to 30 years of the connection existing only in quiet legal paperwork rather than acknowledged family history. My relationship with Theo, I want to note, has deepened considerably through this entire experience, not because of the revelation about the ring itself, but because of how thoroughly Theo committed to genuinely seeing his mother's behavior clearly finally, after years of gradual awakening that this incident accelerated into full clarity. He has apologized to me multiple times for the years he spent minimizing or explaining away patterns he should have confronted considerably earlier. I should have seen it without needing a dramatic reveal to force me to, he told me, several weeks after the dinner. The fact that you had to be scalded with boiling water before I fully understood how serious this had become is something I will carry for a long time. I told him that understanding, even delayed, mattered considerably more than perfect timing, and that I had made my own choices across 6 years, about when and how to share information that might have changed the family dynamic considerably earlier, choices I do not regret but that I also recognize as my own contribution to how long this pattern persisted before finally breaking open. I have been talking for a long time, and I want to land somewhere honest before I let you go. This story is about a ring, and about boiling water, and about a family that finally had to confront a history they had constructed without bothering to examine its foundations. But I think it is really about something else, something I have thought about considerably in the months since that dinner. Some people build their sense of superiority on assumptions they have never bothered to examine, because examining those assumptions would require confronting how unstable their actual foundation is. Diane spent 6 years certain of my unworthiness within her family, certain in a way that felt to her like simple fact rather than constructed narrative, because she had never had reason to question it. I want to be careful about the lesson I am offering here, because I do not think the lesson is simply that hidden wealth or hidden status eventually reveals itself and vindicates the wronged party. That is too simple, and it is also not universally true. Many people endure exactly the kind of treatment I endured from Diane without any hidden ring, without any dramatic revelation waiting to reframe everything that came before. What I think the actual lesson is, the one I have arrived at through considerable reflection in the months since, is this. The people who treat others with casual cruelty, who build hierarchies of worthiness based on superficial markers like family wealth or educational pedigree, are almost always operating on incomplete information, not just about the specific people they are dismissing, but about the actual nature of worth itself. Diane was wrong about me from the very beginning, not because my grandmother turned out to have built a significant company, but because no person's worthiness should have required that kind of validation to be recognized in the first place. I deserved respect within that family from the moment I became part of it, regardless of my grandmother's history, regardless of any company, regardless of any ring. The ring simply forced Diane to confront, finally, what should have been obvious from the beginning. But I do not want anyone watching this to walk away believing that the solution to being treated poorly is having a hidden trump card, waiting to be revealed at the right moment. Most people do not have that trump card. Most people simply deserve basic human respect without needing to prove anything about their family history first. If you are someone who has been treated by family or by anyone else as though your worth requires some external validation you have not yet provided, I want you to know something. The validation you need was never actually about wealth or status or hidden history. It was always simply about being seen as a complete person, deserving of respect, regardless of what you can or cannot prove about where you come from. Okay, we have been here a while, and I am genuinely grateful you stayed for all of it. My name is Maya Ashworth. The burn on my wrist healed completely, leaving only the faintest trace that I notice now only when I look for it specifically. The ring still sits on my right hand, exactly where it has sat for years, exactly where it will continue to sit for the rest of my life. I think about my grandmother often, particularly now, in ways I did not before that dinner forced her legacy into the center of my own family's attention. I think about a young woman in an immigrant family's machine shop, learning metal and mechanics the way other children learn music, building something extraordinary in a world that did not expect her to build anything at all. I think the ring was never really about proving anything to Diane. I think it was always simply about carrying forward something essential, something my mother passed to me with the specific, careful weight such moments carry, something that was never supposed to look like much because it was supposed to last. It lasted. If this story reached you, drop a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. If you have ever had your worth questioned by someone who turned out to be operating on assumptions they never bothered to examine, I want to hear about it. I read everything. Subscribe if you are new here. New story every single day. Take care of yourselves. And remember, the things that were never supposed to look like much, sometimes those are exactly the things built to last. I will see you in the next one.